This week I attended an interesting lecture entitled "Does the Cross Have Disabled Access?" Many of those who attended were disabled, and some of them shared their own experience of being disabled in Christian community. One of the things I came away with is the realization that while we have made some progress in recognizing the ways that we unintentionally exclude others, there's still some way to go. And I think that is both practically and ethically, if you will. It's a challenge. Practically, we're challenged to make sure that our physical spaces, the spaces we gather in, are suitable for people of all physical abilities. I came across this interesting picture which highlights some of the indignity that disabled people face in this area of accessibility. I'm going to show you a picture now. As you can see, this man who's in a wheelchair had been invited to come and speak on accessibility, and at a conference around that very issue, they hadn't thought ahead, think that perhaps he might need access to the podium. It seems like a fairly basic mistake, doesn't it? But it's one that I think is repeated in many other spaces and other places, and the solution isn't all that difficult. For those practical considerations, we have the technology available. It's not difficult to make accessibility a priority. But of course, the other change that has to happen is that internal one, the ethical, the perceptual change. It's seen in the attitudes and assumptions that people carry, and in Christian circles, it has sadly often been harmful to the disabled people. You can see it in all kinds of ways, and the testimony of disabled folks speaks volumes. Some who have perhaps encountered those well-intentioned Christians who offer to pray for them in the middle of Marks and Spencer's that they might get out of their wheelchair. We see this attitude in some theologies that see disability as some kind of sad consequence of the fall, or even worse, a kind of demon that needs to be driven out. In all kinds of ways, we have erected barriers in our ways of thinking, which exclude, and they can also dehumanize those who are disabled. And as I approached our readings for Sunday morning, as I looked through the texts in the lectionary, I quickly realized that one of them in particular was speaking to me, and I think to us this week. And it's from Acts 8, the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Because in this story, the Ethiopian eunuch asks a very important question. You might not have noticed this question before when you've read the passage or heard it spoken about. But for me, this question sits at the very heart of this passage, and it speaks to us in very urgent ways even today. And I wonder if by now you want to know what that question is. Well, keep listening and you'll find out. I think it'd be helpful just to explore again the setting of this scene. Philip has been told by an angel to go south, to go along the road that leads out into the wilderness. He does what he's told, but also travelling on that road into the wilderness from Jerusalem was an Ethiopian eunuch, an important man, a man who worked for the queen of the Ethiopians. So now we have these two people interacting in a space in the wilderness. This man is from Ethiopia, and while we're used to having Google Earth, we can click on a few buttons and zoom all around the world. People in this time didn't understand necessarily the geography, and for them Ethiopia was simply a place very, very far away. Most people will never even get to in their lifetimes. Anyway, this man from Ethiopia, as he's travelling along, is reading. And again, there were no Kindles in those days, so for for this man to be reading, as he was going along, reading a scroll, it meant that he had some influence, some wealth, but also that he could read, that he is an important and educated man. And he's reading from Isaiah, which tells us that this man is clearly interested in the Jewish faith, maybe even a convert to Judaism, although we can't tell for sure from the text. But we do know he is a man on a journey, both physically and spiritually. And the Spirit has whispered in Philip's ear to catch up with him and join him in his chariot. So Philip does what he is told, and he starts to run, and he finally gets near enough to the carriage of this Ethiopian man to hear what he is reading. Philip can hear that he's reading from Isaiah 53, and he asks the man, "Do you understand what you are reading?" He responds, how can I understand unless someone guides me? And so Philip is invited onto the chariot, and he asks the man, "What is it you've been reading? What is the passage that is confusing you?" And he says it's Isaiah 53, the part where Isaiah speaks of the suffering servant. And that's an interesting choice of reading, but we'll come back to that later on perhaps. Philip starts where this man had been reading, and he begins to tell him all about Jesus. And Philip's discussion with this man makes a huge impression on him. And here, finally, I can reveal to you the question which is so important in this passage, and I think for us today. The Ethiopian man looks and says, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? What is to prevent me from being baptized?" That's a good question. Because there's a story going on behind this story. According to one reading of the scriptures, there are lots of things preventing this man from being baptized. To be baptized is to be welcomed into the family of worshippers, and in the Old Testament it has lots of regulations as to who can receive that welcome. And sadly, this Ethiopian eunuch was one of the people who would have been unwelcome. There are laws written about his kind, laws which say they're not allowed in the temple, they cannot offer their sacrifice. And as I say these things, you might begin to wonder what the backstory of this story is. This man who we meet in the wilderness, coming away from Jerusalem, where he had gone to worship. What kind of welcome had he received there? We know that he's come away with questions that no one answered for him. And we can guess that if they realized who he was in his body, in the fact that he is a eunuch, he wouldn't have got all that far in the temple courts. There were barriers of access for this man. And perhaps that time in Jerusalem for him, those barriers were put up in all kinds of ways. Because this man, this eunuch, represents the kind of ambiguity that we find difficult to tolerate. He was probably castrated as a boy before puberty, because he was a slave in the Queen's court. And we call this man a man, but today we probably would rather say something like a non-binary person, a person who is neither male nor female, a man or woman in gender. He fits into this ambiguous other category. And we human beings haven't tended to cope very well with ambiguity when it comes to people's identity. And just think for a moment, that passage that he had been reading as he journeyed along, Isaiah 53, it's a passage that talks about the suffering servant. I referenced it last Sunday, if you remember. We come to that passage and we connect it to Jesus, understandably. And maybe the eunuch that day was reading that passage because in that suffering servant, he found someone he could identify with. That servant in the text is a man who has been rejected, a man who has been humiliated, a man who has faced all kinds of suffering. And so I ask again, what kind of experience did this eunuch have at the temple that day? And in my mind, in my imagination, I have to think he was perhaps not welcome, rejected, kept out, held at a safe distance. But now he has met Philip in the wilderness, not at Jerusalem, at the temple, out here in the wilderness, the place of risky encounter. And he has now heard Philip explain about Jesus, the one who suffered. And suddenly inside this man's heart there is a burning, a desire for more. He was captivated by this Jesus, and he wanted to take the next step on his journey with him, which is baptism. And so we hear again that question which we might now hear differently. What is to prevent me from being baptized? I wonder, how did he ask that question that day? Was it asked tentatively, expecting yet another rejection, another stage that he couldn't access, another place that his gender ambiguity meant he was going to be refused welcome? Was he expecting Philip to shake his head sadly and offer some platitude like, I'm really sorry, you seem like a good, sincere man, but I can't baptize you? What was to prevent the baptism? The eunuch himself could have probably listed all kinds of reasons for us. He himself has been given. But how does Philip respond? He doesn't even answer the question directly. He simply gives instructions for the chariot to stop, takes the eunuch to the water, and baptizes him. Because for Philip there was nothing to prevent baptism. What a wonderful moment of inclusion and embrace. Out here in the wilderness, Philip had a decision to make. Will I follow the traditions of my people? Will I find a reason to keep this ambiguous person out? Will I take offence at his difference to me? Or will I welcome him in Jesus' name? Thankfully, Philip chose the latter option. He offered this man a welcome that transformed his life. You're probably ahead of me. You probably know where I'm going next. We don't have to do too much work, do we, to connect this story with our own contemporary world? Because if you've paid attention to current events over the last years, you'll know that our culture is in something of a transition moment. We're being asked all kinds of challenging questions. For example, we're being asked, do Black Lives Matter? This man was from Ethiopia, remember? Or we're asked, do we care about the experiences of women? We thought about that last Sunday briefly. And in connection to our reading today, I believe we're asked again, do we care about the experiences of those who don't fit into our gender binaries? Over the years, gender roles have been questioned for some time now. As with those disability matters, so too with this. We've made some progress. You'll find women, shock horror, in all kinds of positions they weren't welcome before. But there's still so much work to be done. And that work has to happen not just in our society, but in our inner worlds as well. The places we make our decisions as to who is allowed in and who we keep out. Because this eunuch's question resonates with us today. What is to keep me from being baptized? If we're honest, can we respond to that question with nothing? I don't think so. I think the church as a whole has a whole history of rejection that we must face up to before we can move forwards. The persecution of those who don't fit into our boxes and our categories. We are suspicious of those who inhabit their bodies in ways that are different to our own. And we've kept far too many people out because of those invisible barriers that we put up. This eunuch challenges us with his question. And I ask the question, if he appeared not on the wilderness road to Philip, but in our church hall, and asked us that question, how would we respond? Would we open up our stage and fill up the pool with water and rejoice over this baptism? Or would we perhaps be cautious and say perhaps we need to talk further? As a society, we're discovering again the subtle ways that we have excluded people from our common spaces. And as a church, we must ask similar questions. We must be at the forefront of welcome, of hospitality, especially for those who are on a journey which leads to Jesus. That's where the eunuch was going. He was going always to Jesus on his journey. And we must be ready to speak of Jesus to those who know what it is to be rejected. We must share how Jesus himself was rejected by others, like our reading from last Sunday, the stone that was rejected by the builders. God has chosen that stone and made it the cornerstone for his building. We must talk of the Jesus who suffered at the hands of his own people, people who should have welcomed him, sent him away. And we must offer the good news that through the death of this Jesus, God has welcomed us all and embrace a welcome into his family, into his presence. And so as we come back to this ancient story from Acts chapter 8, we realise even today we have so much work yet to be done. We must learn from Philip to welcome those that God sends our way, to be willing to challenge all our traditions and our previous understandings in order to guide others to Jesus. Can we do that? What is there to prevent us? Amen.